Now let's look at next little section dealing with reinforced concrete architecture. And that includes steel rods and mesh reinforcements. And you'll notice that many of this architectural style will become much more sculptural. So reinforced concrete and steel have provided raw materials for a variety of new structural forms. Eros Saarinen and his Detroit-based firm were commissioned in 1955 to design the TWA Flight Center. The terminal is a pioneering example of thin shell construction consisting of a reinforced concrete shell that is supported at its corners. The design is bird-shaped and emblematic. Construction features a harmoniously coordinated interior, and it references to TWA's corporate identity, flight. So remember that. It's got a bird-shaped design and it's referencing corporate identity, flight. Saarinen planned the appearance of the building from a purely formal perspective, mainly to exploit marketing opportunities. So it was, if you will, an advertisement piece. It wasn't meant to be, standing long term. And the TWA terminal represents an entirely different approach than other thin concrete shell construction architectural works at that same time. The terminal was built to span a space with minimal material. And we might remember that Saarinen is responsible for building the St. Louis Arch. In this image, you'll note that there are really giant roofs in the Saarinen structure, and that they're supported by a suspension system of the type that's employed for bridge construction. There are tent-like roof lines, and they create interior spaces that are vast open areas. And these are made possible by innovations of a shell structure. The structure is large in size, and the building complements rather than dwarfs human scale. You'll also notice that windows provide aerial views, and the sweeping curves of buildings. A building mimics that of a bird's wings. The structural space energizes and gives a complex sense of grace and motion and balance. And I might just add that this building no longer stands. Was falling apart and had to be demolished. Again, it was just meant to be a temporary structure. But there is a recent, we'll see after this recession that's going on, what's going to happen with it. But there's a recent discussion that this TWA building would be rebuilt within the next 10 years. I will rush immediately to New York to see that when it is. The most influential of the 20th century architects was born in Wisconsin and was the son of a Baptist minister, and that is Frank Lloyd Wright. And we're going to spend just a little bit more time talking about Frank Lloyd Wright because he's that architect that is all around you in the state of Michigan, in your own backyard. He is the most influential architects of the 20th century. He is truly a radical inventor. And there's a couple of different things that you should remember about him is that he invented what's called the prairie style architecture, and that he exploited and also introduced organic architecture. Now, Wright believed in designing structures that were in harmony with humanity, and its environment, a philosophy that he called organic architecture. And this philosophy was best exemplified by Falling Water. It was created in 1935, and it has been called the best all-time work of American architecture. Wright was a pioneer that made extensive use of the cantilevered. Make sure you know this. Basically, cantilever is when a beam is extended at a substantial distance beyond a supporting column or wall, and this overhanging portion is called the cantilever. It doesn't have, it hangs out in free air. Before the use of steel and reinforced concrete, cantilevers were not used because the available materials could not make the concept viable. One of the best known, boldest, and elegant works that uses this principle by Wright occurs in Wright's Kaufman residence, or Falling Water. It's located in Bear Run, Pennsylvania. It's open to the public to take tours. It's a World Heritage Site. And in it, we can see horizontal cantilever roofs that extend from supporting piers. These roofs jut from natural rock ledges of the riverbank and seem almost to float above the waterfall. Vertical accents were influenced by the surrounding trees. The work is harmonious in such a beautiful location. This is an example of prairie style architecture. It is the Roby House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright studied and apprenticed under Louis Sullivan in Chicago at the architecture firm of Sullivan and Adler. And he did this when Sullivan was designing his Wainwright building. You remember the first skyscraper. Wright was Sullivan's chief draftsman. And then after he got caught moonlighting, and Sullivan basically said, "It's time for you to go," he opened up his own office in the community of Oak Park, Illinois in 1893. And it was there that he designed a series of houses with low horizontal lines that echoed the flat prairie landscape. That distinctive approach became known as his prairie style. It mimics the surrounding landscape, the prairie color, the horizontal placement, and materials. There are stained glass windows on the interior that have abstract designs of the flora of the landscape. And then there's another thing that's very important is that he starts creating this vocabulary of compression upon entering the space through alcoves and entryways. And then once you pass through those doorways, this notion of expansion once you arrive on the inside. So you kind of like squeeze, and then all of a sudden you arrive in this delightful, airy, well-lit space. That same year, Wright visited a Japanese tea house at an exposition in Chicago, and this really had a profound effect. He began incorporating asymmetrical balance, large extended eaves, and flexible open plans that were all based in the traditional Japanese house design. He started incorporating those notions into his work. At this point, he becomes more sensitive to nature as influencing human life. than the often static symmetry of traditional American homes. And back to Falling Water in the Kaufman House, will we note that Wright was among the first to use open plan in its houses. He starts to break with the tradition of closed box like houses. He eliminates walls between rooms and large windows, excuse me, and discovers that one of the best ways to open a closed room is to place windows in corners. And with these devices, created these flowing spaces that open to the outdoors. He welcomes natural light and related houses to their site's climates. He starts using sliding glass doors, which were influenced by the sliding paper shoji doors of traditional Japanese architecture. And this house is located very close to you in Grand Rapids. It's called the Meyer-May House. And here we'll talk a little bit about organic architecture, and that Wright's guiding philosophy was in the concern for simplicity, sensitivity to the character of the space, and the materials that should express these kind of organic ideals for architecture. According to Wright, the word organic goes beyond its strictly biological meaning and refers to the integration of all aspects of the form, the part to the whole, and the whole to the part. And thus, architecture should honor the character of natural conditions as well as the materials and purpose of the structure. And while we're looking at the Meyer-May house image, there are several, half a dozen or so Frank Lloyd Wright homes here in Kalamazoo, as well as Battle Creek, Michigan. There's plenty of Frank Lloyd Wright homes that are located in Detroit area, but because his firm was near Chicago, there are many Frank Lloyd Wright residential homes in our area. Now he was going beyond residential homes and dealing with commercial architecture. And in this case, we see the Johnson Wax building that is located in Racine, Wisconsin. And pretty much this is the the picture on the right. You'll notice that there are these floating kind of lily pad framework for the roof line. And then that's all naturally lit. This is absolutely beautiful. You can imagine working in this office space with all of this natural light. But one thing that you'll notice is that he's using nickel elements in terms of color. They're all kind of natural. He's using the bricks that match the floor line, that match the paint, that match the desk, that match the natural wood elements of the desk. These were all totally thought out by Wright in terms of design, interior as well as exterior. And here we see that he went so far as designing the office furniture, although not very many of those exist in the office space to this day. You'll notice they only have 3 legs, which make them very wobbly. It was reported that the office workers were constantly tipping over and falling on the ground. But you'll notice how that shape in the chair is carried through even to the sky. The piers that hold the roof line to it. And then finally, right into his career with his very last work, the Guggenheim Museum. And this is built in 1959. The museum is a landmark work of 20th century architecture. It's a cylindrical building. It's wider at the top than at the bottom, and it has a skylight at the top. The work is conceived as a temple of the spirit. Part of what makes it so unique is that it has a ramp gallery that extends from the ground level in a long continuous spiral along the outer edges of the building to end just under the ceiling skylight. I would highly recommend that you visit the museum, even if you just walk in the foyer and you look up at the structure. It's well worth your time if you go to New York. And was the last building of his career. Just a quick look at shell architecture. This work is a geodesic dome by Buckminster Fuller. He's an inventor, an architect, and a structural engineer. And he pointed out that carefully guided technology can provide the maximum benefit, minimum cost. Fuller put this concept to work when he developed the principle, the geodesic dome, related to polyhedrons found in nature. Fuller's goal was to not imitate nature, but to recognize and employ its principles. His first major work was the U.S. Pavilion at the 1967 Expo in Montreal. Now, the strength of the geodesic dome makes it possible to enclose more space with less material than any other structural system. It can be erected from lightweight, inexpensive, standardized parts in a very short time. It's a skeleton that is constructed of modular, linear elements joined together to form single planes. As these are combined, the resulting structure can be covered with a variety of materials to make the enclosed space weatherproof. And his goal was also to do more with less. If you're ever interested in seeing any of his work, you can visit his Dymaxion House, which is a case study, and it's located at the Henry Ford Museum. And very enjoyable too. You can go inside it and you can look at it. But the military employed some of these ideas that were invented by Buckminster Fuller for quick camp setups and things of that nature. And then lastly, looking at the work of Frank Gehry. In recent years, Frank Gehry's been selected to design several major showplaces for performing and visual arts. The Guggenheim Museum was completed at the Harbor's Edge in Bilbao, Spain in 1997. It is an example of functional sculpture as architecture. He calls the design a metallic flower. And it is a dramatic titanium surface clustered of soaring and dancing volumes that climax in a gigantic glass enclosed atrium. Now, when you think that titanic material, think back to the Statue of Liberty and this hammered copper. And he's not that far from how those guys were using their material. There is a feeling in his work of active interplay among geometrically loose, almost organic masses with suggestive boat-like forms and spaces. The museum is a major event that enabled an urban renewal plan act to clean up and revitalize a deteriorated port area in which it was built and has been incredibly successful there in Spain. And Gehry buildings are all over the place. Probably the nearest one is in Cleveland. Their School of Art is a Gehry building, and he's responsible for doing the Disney Symphony Hall in Los Angeles, and I mean the list just goes on. This guy has done a lot of work all over the world.